I'm Gina Duncan with Equality Florida. I am the program director of our transgender inclusion initiative called Transaction and the Transaction Network, and handle the transgender equality effort for Equality Florida across the state. Equality Florida is the state's largest LGBTQ advocacy organization with over 300,000 members. You can find us at equalityflorida.org, and we would encourage you to check us out on our website that has a lot of information there as well. Today we're going to talk about public policy, and certainly, you know, there is a lot of that going on in relation to the transgender community, obviously. Most of it is infringements and attacks on our personal rights and protections in all areas of society with the transgender community. So I really want to kind of drill down on that in reference to where we are there and really have a kind of an open discussion. I don't want to stand up here and prattle on about what's going on, but a lot of questions, you know, questions at any time. We have an hour and a lot of information to cover, but I do want it to be as open and as discussional as possible. So feel free. Let me first tell you a little bit about what we're doing at Equality Florida. And the reason I think this is important is that we are trying to address the issues and the challenges facing our community, the transgender and the non-binary community. Instead of treating the symptoms, we want to treat the illness. And so what we're looking at is what we're calling Tier 2 advocacy, to where we want to find a way to build safe and healthy communities. Because as we know currently going on, besides the public policy issues, the public policy attacks that are being levied towards the transgender community, we basically don't have a healthy societal structure that actually is supporting the transgender and non-binary community. And what does that look like? Well, in creating safe and healthy environments and communities, you know, it's everything from, and it really relates to when transgender people are being murdered. They're very patterned and they're very similar, right? The violence against the transgender community, we all know that drill. But it stems from, and this is kind of the approach we're taking, is, so how does that happen? So number one, for some reason, a transgender person, is either discriminated off their job, or for some reason they fall off the grid. You know, they're going through transition, whatever it may be, they lose employment. They then become homeless. They then resort to extreme measures to survive, in many cases turn to sex work, put themselves in harm's way, end up being a victim, you know, found in a deserted place the next day. So in that scenario of violence against transgender people, we see all of the disconnects that we want to address in supporting the transgender community. You know, it's a lot more than understanding pronouns and understanding the nuances of our community being binary or not binary, non-binary, whatever it may be. It's really about, we need to create societies that understand the community. And a lot of that is predicated on the fact that we have to be visible. And many of you have heard me say this, that the only way we'll make progress, even though it's difficult and we may put ourselves in harm's way, is that we have to be visible. Through visibility, we'll increase awareness. Through awareness, people will then want to know more, hopefully, and look to be educated. And an informed society will create an environment of equity and inclusion. Because we know when negativity is levied towards the transgender community, it comes from a place of ignorance, right? It comes from a place of not understanding gender identity and the basics of that. It comes from a place of all this false rhetoric in reference to transgender people being a safety issue, public safety issue, a la bathroom bills, things like that. So what we have to do, and what we're attempting to do at Equality Florida and the Transaction Network, is we've created work groups. We have a network of over 60 transgender and non-binary advocates spanning from Key West to Pensacola who have come together and gone through training, message and media training, all kinds of different training, public speaking training, how to advocacy training on the ground, things like that, so that we have this network where we can come together to implement these things, and we form these different work groups. One of our groups is handling homelessness, and we'll talk about the attacks on that, but that's an important area. Another area is criminal and social justice. Everything from law enforcement, understanding the transgender and non-binary community, to incarceration issues, which are horrendous and very archaic, to non-discrimination in employment, to educating law enforcement and incarceration issues. We also have a group working on health and wellness, mental health, the gaps in health care for transgender people, the lack of education, the lack of understanding that a lot of healthcare organizations, are really racing to catch up. We found that over the years, in healthcare especially, is because for the longest time, we lived in a binary world, and binary people of my generation didn't engage major healthcare organizations. Why? Because we went to specialists, right? If you wanted to transition, maybe you did facial feminization surgery, you'd go to a specialist. Breast augmentation specialist. Gender confirmation surgery specialist, right? Electrology specialists. So what we found is major healthcare organizations are now racing to try to catch up and have a deeper understanding of supporting transgender people. And we see that relates to insurance, but I'm doing all kinds of trainings all across the country for major healthcare organizations who, quite frankly, are at the very basics of Trans 101 in reference to understanding pronouns and non-binary concepts and things like that. So we see healthcare is an area that's certainly racing to catch up. And then lastly, homelessness is an area that is, a very important issue to our community. And then a peripheral piece is working with the faith-based organizations that tend to be our opponents when we're trying to get work done. So that's kind of the laying out the platform for what we're doing and what Transaction's doing in reference to going after these different areas. Okay, so let me talk. I want to talk about public policy in 3 areas. And again, questions at any time. But number one, I want to go local, state, and then federal in reference to public policy. And local, I guess, is the first area I want to go to. And this is certainly, stuff going on in Washington, D.C. is certainly coming home to roost in the fact that it almost feels like all of the attacks on the community are getting closer and closer to our front door. And so, I used to say, to borrow from Michelle Obama's line, when they go low, we go local. And there's a lot of validity to that because oftentimes we can't control stuff going on in Washington, D.C. Elections matter. But when they go low, we can go local. We can control what goes on in school boards. We can control educating homeless shelters. We can control local things going on in Central Florida. And I think Orlando is a really good example of that because Orlando, top to bottom, is one of the most progressive and inclusive cities in the country. We have a mayor who certainly believes in that, and we're seeing, everything from human rights ordinances passed to I don't know if you've seen or heard that at City Hall they actually have an all-user restroom, first of its kind in the South. And you ought to go sometime. Go to a city council meeting or whatever, and outside there's a men's bathroom, a women's bathroom, and an all-user bathroom. And it's state-of-the-art in the fact that you go in, and usually, an all-user bathroom or a family bathroom is a one facility, right? This has 6 stalls. And the stall doors are from head to toe. They're from ceiling to floor. So ultimate privacy to kind of push back against that issue. And um, yeah, at any time you could have a cisgender person in there, you could have a transgender person, a non-binary person, a handicapped person in there. You could have any user in that particular bathroom. And that's, you know, it's a symbol, right? It's kind of a statement that the city of Orlando is putting their money where their mouth is and truly saying we are a progressive and inclusive place, and we're going to show it with bathrooms. Public accommodations. Because after all, where do we always get attacked? In public policy areas. We get attacked in public, with public policy, with public accommodations, aka bathrooms and locker rooms. So in looking at the local landscape, it's important to note that our local efforts matter and our local coordination matters a lot as well. So when looking at the different areas, let's look at homeless shelters, for example. And this is where it really comes home to roost for me, in the fact that a couple of weeks ago, we did this large training for the Coalition for the Homeless. 100 people in the audience talking about transgender and non-binary concepts in reference to providing an inclusive and affirming place in homeless shelters. Based on the Fair Housing Act of 2012, which in the Fair Housing Act has what's called the Equal Access Rule, where the government put out guidance to homeless shelters saying that you must respect everyone's gender identity and provide equal access to shelters for all people based on that gender identity. That was on a Tuesday. On Friday, Ben Carson, who doesn't even know what REO means, Ben Carson rolls out the rollback of homeless shelter protections to where they're basically rolling back any kind of protections for transgender people in homeless shelters. And you talk about how heinous is that our most vulnerable segment perhaps of our population in their most vulnerable time in a homeless shelter, you're attacking transgender people there. And it really comes home in the fact that when Irma came through, remember Irma was a recent hurricane that was supposed to go up the East Coast and then ended up going up the West Coast. And so there were a lot of people that were impacted, and there were a lot of people, including me, who were, because I was living in St. Pete at the time, who were under mandatory evacuation orders. I was getting 2 phone calls minimum, like a day, the week before as the hurricane was coming, from transgender people who were being turned away from shelters simply because they were transgender. One woman even was interrogated at the front door asking, because it was a woman's shelter, and this person had been living their authentic life, identifying as female for years and years, and she was asked if she'd had her surgery before they would let her in the door. So that's an area we need to work on. Homeless shelters, when we felt like they were getting it, and now we're finding that homeless shelters are kind of like, well, what's really going on? What is our true guidance with the federal government saying this? I know what you're saying, we should be doing, and what really, probably feels right and humane to homeless shelters, but then they're getting rollout, they're getting all this, pushback from the Trump administration saying, not so much. You really don't have to respect one's gender identity and that kind of thing. So that's an issue. Secondly, law enforcement. At the local level, we've been addressing law enforcement. And as you know, unfortunately, in our public policy world, that last year Florida led the country in transgender murders. We had 5 transgender murders in Florida. All were very similar, transgender women of color. And all were very similar MOs in reference to the way they were killed. And this is that cycle of violence that I was talking about, this is part of how do we unwind this cycle of violence that impacts all of us, but mainly people of color within our community. But we found through that law enforcement, again, had a long way to go. Because what happens in all of these murders, both here and nationally, is what? The person gets misgendered, right? And we hear the code. If you ever hear this, this is code. When you know, law enforcement, they always come back and they say, well, we might have had a misstep. We thought it was a woman at first, but then we realized it was a man, or usually it was a guy in a dress. And if you ever hear guy in a dress, that's code for really, I don't support the transgender community and I'm a bigot. And we hear that. Well, we thought we were doing the right thing, but then it turned out it was a guy in a dress. Wrong. So, how do you address that? And again, we're addressing what? The symptom, not the illness. But we went and built a program around training law enforcement to where we partnered with the ACLU and we partnered with the Department of Justice, and they have what's called a Community Relations Service division of DOJ based out of Miami. And we first got 6 people certified to do DOJ trainings, and we started doing trainings across the state for law enforcement. Central Florida, Tampa, certainly focusing in on Jacksonville and the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. You might not know this, but JSO, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, is the largest law enforcement agency in the country. Because Jacksonville, oddly enough, has the largest land mass of any city in the country. I didn't know that until I got involved in working up there. But it's the biggest city, not by population, but by land mass, which is interesting. But anyway, we slugged through training JSO in various levels. We trained their leadership, then we trained all their lieutenants, then we went in and we trained their sergeants, and then we did webinars for rank and file so they would get some semblance of transgender cultural competency training. Whether that gets, it takes effect or not, we'll see. Part of law enforcement has also been a commitment that JSO did to develop an LGBTQ liaison team. Because they always came back in that they would talk about, well, we can only go off of, when we're trying to identify a victim, we can only go off of what's their IDs that they're carrying. Makes perfect sense, but that's wrong in the fact that people should be identified based on their gender identity, not on what they're carrying in their purse or their wallets, okay? But the way, well, how do we get there? Well, you have an active and engaged and embedded LGBTQ liaison team who knows the community and is a part of the community. I know we have that here in Orlando. Our liaison people at OPD are very much entrenched in our community. They're at prides, they're at our town halls, they're embedded and included in our community. So that's a big part of it. So that's law enforcement. Homelessness, law enforcement. Another big area that we're working on is corporate trainings. Over the last 5 years, we have had the good fortune of working and providing transgender cultural competency training by over 250 major corporations across the country. And we found that actually this is a positive area in the fact that most major corporations kind of get it. They understand that by developing an inclusive and welcoming workplace environment, that they can truly attract the best and the brightest to come to work there. Because people want to be able to bring their true selves to work and be able to do their work without, carrying around some kind of secret or, having a different life during the day versus at night, things like that. So we've seen actually that our major corporations across Florida have helped us lead in this area. And when we go to Tallahassee to talk about all the stuff we're doing there in reference to non-discrimination acts and things like that, our major corporate partners are with us. So employment is a really good area. Let's talk about healthcare. Again, as I said, racing to catch up. We're doing more and more trainings for healthcare. Major healthcare organizations like Orlando Health is a good example. I'm doing a workshop for them next week, actually, and this will be my 6th one with them. But healthcare also is an area that, quite frankly, the transgender community has a disconnect with the healthcare profession and the fact that there's a lack of trust there because people oftentimes are misgendered or disrespected or demeaned in reference to healthcare. We find study after study shows that transgender people will either forego or postpone needed health care simply because they don't want to go to a healthcare facility and, face discrimination or bias or something like that. So they might I might as well just not go. or there's insurance issues, so it's financial. So we do see that healthcare is another area that needs some work, but we're working in that area to make sure that comes along. Um, I should have said in the social justice and law enforcement area, incarceration is also an issue, which is pretty ugly in the fact that in looking at prisons and incarceration situations all across, we've been benchmarking prisons all across Florida in reference to what are their policies. And for the most part, the way prisons handle incarcerated transgender people is to put them in social isolation, or what's the word I'm looking for when you get put in solitary confinement. That's kind of the answer. If they're pre-op transgender, then usually they're put into what was the word again? Solitary confinement. Jacksonville is kind of interesting in the fact that the way it was explained to me in working with JSO is that they actually have a high-risk inmate dorm where transgender people are housed and they say we put our transgender people in the high-risk dorm where also we put Jacksonville Jaguar football players. And I thought that was weird, right? It's like, why would you say that? And are there a lot of Jacksonville, Jaguar football players being put in prison? So I thought that was kind of strange. They're a high-risk group as well. But what we do find is all across the state that's kind of the MO, is the people are put in isolation. And you've heard the stories about some people, they get housed based on their genitals. So if you still have a penis, you get put in with the men. If you don't, you get put in the women and that kind of thing. So a lot of work to be done in the areas of incarceration. So that's part of law enforcement. HIV/AIDS. Let's talk about that, because that's another area we're doing a lot of work in. Our community, unfortunately, has an inordinate and disproportionate high incidence of HIV/AIDS. And in working with organizations like the AIDS Health Foundation, which is a national organization, we've been rolling out a series of educational workshops there. And that falls pretty much in the line of healthcare in reference to, the person should be welcoming and inclusive from the very start, from admission all the way through, working with a primary care physician. And we find that the key there with healthcare and with all kind of admissions processes is we tell them that your enemy is inconsistency and ambiguity. You need to provide a platform where people can self-identify when they walk in the door. Enable people to self-identify and control the situation so that they can tell you who they are, so they won't be demeaned, they won't be misgendered, they won't be mispronounced, whatever it may be. So we train them in reference to expanding their admission forms to give people more options and things like that. And we find even in the HIV area that there's a lot of training that needs to be done there. The engagement, and you might know Central Florida has a very high incidence of HIV, as does Florida per capita. So we have organizations that are doing this work, but in the transgender area, their competencies are not where they should be. So we need to get that training done, and we're working to move that along as well. So on a local, kind of platform in reference to supporting the transgender community, that's where we are. Let me stop there for a moment and ask for questions. Yes?
Physical nature of the person, depending on where they went.
Yeah.
What if they had had the surgery and they have both qualifications?
Yeah. Well, number one, what they were doing is they would simply identify the person based on their ID. And then, secondarily, they would, do whatever. But see, the worst thing part about that is, and this also led to doing media training, where we've done a lot of training with media both print media as well as TV stations in reference to getting this right. Because what happens was, and what happened with these 5 women who were murdered in the state of Florida, that when this misgendering took place, and it looks like this, law enforcement discovers, they get called to the scene and that kind of thing, and their initial, for some reason, they want to be in a hurry to put this information out. So the first thing they do is they turn to the reporter who's on the scene and says just that. Well, the ID says this is Bill Jones, who lives at, ABC Smith Street. And at first we thought it was a woman, but it turns out it's a man in a dress. So then that media person says, well, Bill Jones was found murdered, dressed like a woman, murdered in the south side of Jacksonville. So all of a sudden what happens is our community gets pissed, and law enforcement and the media become the story, not the person who's been murdered, right? We go after the media, we go after law enforcement, they're misgendering people, they're disrespecting them in death, double, disrespecting them. They've already been murdered, and now you're misgendering them. So they become the story. So our goal there has been, even though again we're like treating the symptom, is the person murdered needs to be the story. And sadly, as you might know, those 5 murders that happened in Florida, none of those have been anywhere near solved. Because quite frankly, I don't think really the energy is there. We called upon the governor, Rick Scott at the time, to even say the word transgender. At the time, we couldn't even get Rick Scott to say transgender, much less categorize these as hate crimes, which they should have been. And then lastly, to devote perhaps some more resources to JSO as we got JSO ramped up, to provide some state resources to try to solve these murders. None of them have been anywhere near solved. And we continue to see, as you know, violence against the transgender community only continues to increase. 2 years ago, a transgender person was murdered somewhere in the world every 3 days. Every 3 days. Currently in the United States, we're actually down from our usual run rate of murdered people. 9 so far in the United States for this year. Last year there was, 29, I think. Usually that's about the number, 25 to 29 people. Almost predominantly transgender women of color between the ages of 20 and 35. They're very similar. They're very patterned. They should be hate crimes. They should be solved. And we're not seeing that. Okay. Let me talk a little bit about state stuff. And this is shifting a little bit more into some positive news. Well, it was positive news. In that we've been partnering with the Southern Legal Council, who, if you don't know, they put out what's called FloridaNameChange.org, which is an amazing resource. If you know someone who is needing to change their personal IDs, jot that down, FloridaNameChange.org. It's an amazing site that walks you through step by step how to change all your personal IDs. Okay. Well, working with them as well as NCTE, the National Center for Transgender Equality, a national organization, our 3 organizations have been working with Department of Health and Vital Statistics to change the process for changing your gender marker on your birth certificate. Now, let me loop this back in the fact that, as you know, anytime a bathroom bill or any kind of anti-trans legislation comes up, it's always based on what? That we're going to discriminate against the transgender people and require them to use facilities that align with what? Their birth certificate, right? Marion County Schools, for example, they passed this emergency resolution that said that all students in Marion County had to use the bathroom that aligned with their birth certificate. So, okay, fine. While we fight that, yes?
That some of the laws are written to discriminate based on your original birth certificate. They put the word original in.
Yeah, they're getting that's kind of the new nuance to offset what we're doing. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that being addressed in the state to make sure that that can't happen here?
Yes, we're addressing that at the same time we're trying to get it changed now. In the fact that we are, yeah.
Just to throw something into the mix. So what happens if they go back to my original
Right.
So now
That, yeah,
back to being a male with a vagina.
Okay?
right. Yeah, and that's where all this, when you really, drill down on this, it totally unwinds. But taking that further, the trick has been this, is that we've been marching through the process, and our approach is we need to create a situation that makes it as inexpensive and as seamless as possible for people to change all of their personal IDs and their gender markers all the way through the process. From name change to social to DMV to passport to your birth certificate. And we're like, we've gotten all that done. And the key there is to eliminate, it's already costly enough. In Orange County, I think you can change your name, but it's $475 to do so. You got to petition and go in live and all that kind of stuff. But the obstacles, and when I transitioned, you had to have proof of gender reassignment surgery. You had have your letter, as I did, from Marcy Bowers, saying that this person has undergone gender confirmation, gender, affirmation surgery, whatever you want to call it, and you can now change her gender marker on her driver's license. And I found that so repugnant, that I had to show, yes, I've had this surgery, so you can now change my. We've erased that, so you don't need that. You just need a certification letter from a doctor that says you're under, full-time care for gender dysphoria, and, basically says, I stamp this person as being transgender. But we want to take that, we have to do two things. Eliminate the medical intervention requirement and take that all the way to birth certificates. So we've done that, and now we have the Department of Health is actually issuing birth certificates that do not require any medical intervention, and they're changing gender marker based on all the information you build up during this process. You present that and you can get your gender marker changed on your birth certificate now. They have yet to codify that in writing. We keep pushing them to do that. They need guidance from, they just had some personnel changes at the Department of Health with the new administration coming in. So we're trying to get them to actually put out a policy statement on that. But in the meantime, they are changing birth certificates. Yes. Yes, it does vary. Each process and procedure varies per state. So this is. Yeah, it depends on what Nebraska's requirements are. You could get a lot done here in reference to like your driver's license, things like that. Okay, but as far as birth certificate, yeah, you have to go to the state of birth, who issued the original birth certificate. Yeah. Any other questions there? Okay. Insurance. We've been working with FIORA, or the Florida Insurance Office of Regulation, in trying to implement Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act. Now that sounds pretty technical and dry, but what that did was 2 years ago, in the late stages of the Obama administration, all the days, they passed Section 1557 of ACA. And what Section 1557 says is that there cannot be any kind of sex discrimination in reference to insurance and health care under ACA. And basically what that addressed for us, for transgender people who opted to transition, is that they eliminated any exclusions that were previously there. So when I transitioned, there were all kinds of exclusions, which basically my insurance company would not cover things like facial feminization surgery because they considered it cosmetic, right? Exclusions. So what Section 1557 did is it went in and said, well, that's sex discrimination, so gender identity falls under that based on the EEOC federal guidelines. So they implemented 1557 to wipe out exclusions so that when you did go to whatever services you needed to transition, that was covered by insurance. Great thing. Just got kicked in, just rolling, wonderful. We've been working with The Department of Insurance, the insurance commissioner is a young progressive guy who's been very positive with us in reference to getting this done as well. And we've been waiting for them to just finish kind of benchmarking and talking to insurance companies all across the state of Florida to ensure that all this was indeed covered over and above ACA with private care and that kind of thing. And then the Trump administration rolls back these protections and basically just, erase 1557. So now we have insurance carriers who, they're like a lot of agencies and organizations around the state, is they're kind of sitting on their hands until they get better guidance in reference to what they should do. While we're this close from just having the insurance commissioner put out a policy statement, the Trump administration comes in and wipes out all that work. Meeting after meeting, month after month of providing information to the Department of Insurance, and then to see this happen was something that just gutted us because it was so much hard work that was put into that. So that's another challenge, but something that has been positive up until this point. It's important to note that Nikki Fried, I don't know if you know that name, but Nikki Fried is your agriculture commissioner. She's young, she's progressive. She, as soon as her team got into place, she engaged Equality Florida to help them write their non-discrimination policy within her department. And I have the honor of having written the transgender piece, or the gender non-discrimination piece of that policy that she adopted. So super progressive. And, you'd be surprised where Nikki Fried's picture shows up. Everything covers everything from what? Elevators to cigarettes. That department has all kinds of different intersections with our lives. So very cool that they're super progressive, and they're certainly going in the right direction. Let's circle back to school boards, if I may. Okay. As you might know, especially if you have kids of school age, there are 67 school districts across the state of Florida. There also are 67 school districts who are operating independently of each other when it comes to LGBTQ policy and procedure in schools. There is no state guidance. We do have a commissioner of schools or commissioner of education in Tallahassee, but the state will not put out any definitive policies or procedures for schools. So each school district is left to their own devices to develop their own policies and their own procedures. And as I touched on earlier, it's all over the board. We've got leaders in Florida like Broward County who actually came out 5 years ago and published what they call the Broward LGBTQ Critical Support Guide for guidance for schools, and that's actually been a model for school districts all across the country. From that came what's called Schools in Transition, which is a guidance book, a policy guide that's plug and play between these two guidance manuals. You can basically go to any school district and go, here you go. This has all been baked for you. All you have to do is implement it. But instead, we have school districts, over 67 school districts, only 55 of them have comprehensive protections for LGBTQ kids. And we're fighting an uphill stream there in the fact that we, our attempted suicide rate for K through 12 kids is roughly 50%. So we have a very vulnerable community that needs protections and guidance. And each school district, and certainly it varies per, like Orange County is super progressive, or quite progressive and doing really good work, GSAs, the whole bit. And then we have school districts that usually align with the more rural they are, the more conservative they are, and the more they are lacking in protections for LGBTQ kids. Marion County is a great example of what not to do. They have totally been influenced by the Liberty Council, which is a hate group right over here in Maitland, who threatened to sue them over public accommodations, and they basically folded and said that kids could only use bathrooms that align with their birth certificates. So school districts are an area that we definitely need to work on. Okay. Moving up, and back on my table is, and some of you have seen this because I use this in a lot of workshops that I use, but I know you can't see that probably, but just the schematic is the overall picture. This is what Florida looks like. And on this side is what Florida looked like 20 years ago, and then we have this is Florida now, and you can see the shaded areas. What those shaded areas represent are roughly 42 cities and counties who have passed fully inclusive human rights ordinances that protect people against discrimination. And what that basically means is cities and counties have passed human rights ordinances that protect discrimination, protect us against discrimination, or anyone against discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity in the areas of housing, employment, and public accommodations. Public accommodations meaning shelters, bathrooms, airports, restaurants, all those kind of things. Mainly bathrooms, because that's where they attack us, right? So we've got, at this point, almost 70% of the population of Florida is covered by these human rights ordinances. But we have a patchwork of human rights ordinances to where, for example, I can get in my car in Orange County, where we have great, really powerful HRO, and I can drive to, say, Pensacola for work and get out of my car in Pensacola with less rights and protections than when I got in my car. Pensacola has nothing. I can be harassed in the bathroom. I can be refused service. I can be refused employment, housing in Pensacola because they have no human rights ordinances whatsoever. Oddly enough, Broward County, 30 minutes that way, county I grew up in, has nothing. No cities, not a county, HRO as well. So your rights and protections as transgender people or non-binary people depend on your zip code, which is totally wrong, right? Do you have to make a conscious thought process that, say you have a trans child, and so you have to put some thought behind, well, we need to move to a particular county so that I can try to do some research and ensure that my child will be protected in school and that we will be protected overall, with city or county ordinances and that kind of thing. And that shouldn't be a thought process we should even have to go through. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to get a statewide non-discrimination law passed, the Competitive Workforce Act. Equality Florida introduced the Competitive Workforce Act 10 years ago. It has only seen the light of day getting to a committee one time, where it died in a 5-5 vote. The Competitive Workforce Act was called that because we thought that where we could find common ground with conservative legislators, and we all know that Tallahassee is this conservative bubble, not necessarily the city itself, but our legislature is certainly led by conservative Republican leadership that thwarts progressive legislation any chance they get. But we developed the Competitive Workforce Act in cooperation with our major employers across Florida and formed a coalition of over 250 major employers. And then these are the big boys, the Lockheed Martins, the Disneys, the Dardens, the EA Sports, organizations like that go to Tallahassee with us and they lobby legislators. And we all, bank on, we saw what happened in North Carolina, right, with HB2, where just the opposite happened. So we saw the power of the purse in reference to business. So our coalition is based on, we should pass this in Florida because this will, create a welcoming Florida and companies will want to come here. And with companies coming here, we will have more jobs. And we kind of think everybody would agree on that. Economic development is good. Having more jobs for Floridians is a good thing. Let's pass this so more companies want to come here. And a good example is Amazon. Amazon HQ2, they made a solid look at Florida and then passed because we didn't have a statewide non-discrimination law. And I heard before we had protections in Orlando, I remember hearing the CEO of EA Sports say just that he had people in California that he wanted to transfer to Orlando, and this was before we had an HRO, and he said, but I'm not going to have them leave their rights and protections in San Francisco to come here to a hostile environment. So it does speak to jobs. However, the Competitive Workforce Act, like I said, is a bill that we introduce year after year, year after year. This year, it was the most co-sponsored bill of any bill in Tallahassee. We had 72 bipartisan co-sponsors of the Competitive Workforce Act. And still, leadership would not put it in front of a committee. Because once the bill is drafted, leadership gets hold of it, they assign it to a committee. It has to go through 3 committees. If it passes each committee, they amend it, they carve it up, that kind of stuff. And then it goes to the floor, and then they vote on it. We can't even get it to a committee. So that's work for us to do, right? That's what we've got to really push back on. And then escalating that, it moves up to the federal level. And similarly, we have the Equality Act, which, has been passed by the House. First time ever such a measure has been done. We know it's going to die a horrible death in the Senate unless something drastically changed. But it's interesting that the Equality Act almost has the exact same verbiage of our Competitive Workforce Act in Florida. It basically is a bill that says that you can't discriminate against people based on their gender identity and sexual orientation. And it lists all of the protected classes. We're just adding gender identity and expression and sexual orientation in the areas of housing, employment, and public accommodations. So we'll see where that goes. We're not optimistic. We're really fired up that the House did it. We've got a lot of good momentum in the House. But as you probably saw, there was a post even today on Facebook where, the Senate is where all good House bills go to die, right? They go over to the Senate and they're just being, carved up and killed off and not even heard in a lot of cases. So that's a real issue. Now, let me stop there. Covering a lot of ground. Any questions about that stuff? Clarifications? Any questions at all? Kind of like State of the Union of where we are. Okay. Let me talk about, shifting gears, the attacks on the community as of now, and kind of do a little bit of an inventory as far as that. As you might know, and this is where we all really, this is really a call to action in 2 ways. How am I doing on time? I think my watch has stopped. I had 2:45 to... Okay. Okay. I got 10 minutes, right, or so. I wanted to talk about these rollbacks, and this is where we really need to, as my executive director, my boss, Nadine Smith, says, you can't win if you don't fight. And oftentimes, we get resistance fatigue. I know I get advocacy fatigue in the fact that we keep pushing forward and we feel like we're taking all these steps, and then all of a sudden there's a rollback of something we've been working on, like that homeless shelter thing. Here's the inventory of the attacks on our community. Number 1 started with the rollback of school guidance. You might have remembered under, the Obama administration, Department of Justice implemented, Title IX, reemphasized protections. That was this famous, Attorney General at the time saying, I see you, I support you, we will be with you, et cetera, to the community. So that was the first sign, and that was the first rollback. Secondly came, and still to be, we haven't seen the total baked version, but the erasure of a lot of LGBTQ specific questions in reference to the census, right? So let's erase people there. Then came what? The Transgender Military Ban, which is totally flawed. It's based on no substantive, rational thinking except for bigotry and hatred. So, Military Ban. Then came repeal and erasure of transgender protections in healthcare that we talked about under 1557 and that kind of thing. And then most recently, the homeless shelter thing, erasing equal access for homeless shelters. So I was at a town hall in Brevard County 2 nights ago, and someone stood up and said, "Can you tell me why they're doing this?" And I'd like to throw that out to y'all. I mean, usually I often, in doing the work I do and hearing people speak, and words matter to me in my world and what people say, but oftentimes I wonder about their motivation. Fear.
Fearing what they do not understand.
Absolutely.
I think it's also, I studied hate for my background is in that and everything. And one of the things people do to galvanize their base and to galvanize group identity, they tend to attack people that are the most vulnerable in a society. And that's to galvanize their base to then be able to attack later on the groups that are less vulnerable. But when you race the vulnerable, it becomes easier to attack the less vulnerable. And if you think about it, there's very few groups more vulnerable than the transgender and gender nonconforming and non-binary population.
Yeah,
Um,
agree.
and so I think that has a tremendous amount to do it. And so if we, they're banking on the fact that we don't have a voice. And so our power is our voice in many ways, right? Because they're
Yeah.
banking on that not being substantial. So.
Well said. And I agree. Any other thoughts there?
That's what they did in Britain.
Isn't that funny? Because I was talking to my sister last night about an incident you might have seen me post that I was kind of somewhat targeted coming out of that town hall in Brevard County a couple nights ago, and and we started talking about all these different attacks on our community, and my sister says this really just so reminds me of everything I've studied about Nazi Germany and the attack on the Jewish population. And while, we certainly don't want to compare that, there's a lot of differences, and that was certainly a horrendous situation. You never know, how ours is going to develop. But it does feel like that. There are similarities to a lot of, there's similarities to the civil rights movement. There's certainly similarities to Germany and the attack on a particular vulnerable population. But that's kind of the call to action. The why is exactly that. We're the easiest to pick on, and what is this administration trying to do? They're trying to create a, non-diverse, tribal community of conservative thinking Americans.
I also think people attack what they fear because they fear that they might be the same way.
And that's a great point. People do attack what they fear and what they don't understand.
But what they might be.
But what they might be. And we see that a lot. Yeah.
People that will be.
Yeah. Yeah, you see that in a lot of elected officials that, are the most adamant about pushing back against LGBTQ rights. The next you hear they've been arrested in a bathroom with a young boy or something like that. So that certainly is the case. We're about okay, got 5 minutes. Let me kind of wrap up with a story, if I may. And some of you might have already heard this story, but I just love this story. In the fact that this kind of speaks to my story and it speaks to the progression of how far we've come. And I kind of call this my DMV story, but true story. Um, and some of you have heard this 1,000 times, and I apologize if you have. But in my particular journey, I transitioned 13 years ago. And I remember, going through the processes of everything, and, I was at the time regional manager with Wells Fargo, overseeing a third of the state of Florida, 26 branches, 285 employees, a multi-million-dollar budget, and I decided I would transition, and I went to Wells Fargo, and they absolutely supported my transition on the job. My boss was great, my job was there, the whole bit. In transitioning, however, at the time, the DMV would not change your driver's license until you had your gender reassignment surgery. Well, I was planning on that, and I was on Marcy Bauer's waiting list. And unfortunately, Marcy Bauer had a 18-month waiting list. So I transitioned, And I was presenting. I went out to California. I had facial feminization surgery, breast augmentation, waiting on my gender reassignment surgery. I was presenting as Gina. I was at work every day. I was the regional manager, and I traveled a lot for Wells Fargo. And I had to fly a lot. And I had this great picture of Gina on my driver's license, and on that driver's license also had this big M on there. Because at the time, I couldn't change my gender marker until I had my letter from Marcy Bowers saying, yes, this person has had their surgery. So I'm traveling a lot, and every time I would travel, I would go through TSA. I would always get the same thing. They would look at my driver's license, and they'd look at me, and they'd roll their eyes, and they had this look of disgust, and I would be outed every time I traveled, to where it got to where I really just didn't want to travel. But I had to for my job. Anyway, finally, there was an opening. Marcy Bowers had a cancellation, got that done. Once I healed, as soon as I healed, I was running down to the DMV because I wanted to change my driver's license. Had my letter, whole bit. Went over to Winter Garden, and it was so weird because in Winter Garden, it was a brand new DMV, and there was like hardly anyone in there, which we all know is is a total, bizarre situation, because usually, the bane of humanity is in the DMV, right? Screaming kids, it's hot, people are sweating, they're mad, they're angry, they're irritable, and there's nowhere to sit, the whole bit. But there was nobody in this spanking brand new DMV. So I sit down, and I notice, the folks are finishing up with their people, and one guy, and this story used to sound better, but looked very much like Bill Cosby. Now, think of Dr. Huxtable. Don't think about Bill Cosby, okay? Think about the person we used to know. Dr. Huxtable, the lovable dad, okay? He kind of messed up my story, but with his personal issues. But so sure enough, Bill Cosby got done with his, and he said, next. And so I had my letter, and I was walking up to him. I'm thinking, I could well be going to ruin this guy's day. So I handed Bill my driver's license and my letter, and I said, I'd like to get my driver's license adjusted to conform with my information. And he looked at my letter, and he looked at me, and he looked at my license, and he said, just a minute. And, in the DMV, all the walls and everything are acrylic. So I see him go back to the back, and his manager apparently is sitting there. And so I see him, they're both like looking at my stuff and looking at me and looking at my stuff and shaking their heads. And so he comes up, and my heart's like pounding out of my chest, and he says, well, Miss Duncan, everything seems to be in order. If you'll step back, we'll take your picture, and we'll move along with this. And I'm like, oh my God, that's so great. So I took my picture, I sat down, and I noticed that while I was sitting there, was in between customers for Bill, and I noticed he was looking at this picture on his desk of, had to be his 2 grandkids. And you know how you can kind of read people? He looked like he took this deep sigh, and he looked like he was counting the days until he was going to retire. And a kiosk was over here where you went and you got your license, and sure enough, they called my name, and Bill actually went over and got my license and called me up. And as he handed me my driver's license, he looked up at me with his warm, loving eyes, and he said, I have to tell you, you're my first. And instinctively I said, well, I certainly hope I'm not your last. And he said, I hope you're not either. And as I walked out of there, I thought, maybe we just changed a heart and a mind that day. Maybe this guy is going to go home and raise those 2 grandbabies with an open heart and an open mind towards all people. And that's all we can ask. If we can change one heart and a mind a day, then we can make a difference together. So thank you. It's been a great session.
Thank you very much, Gina. All right, we have 2 more speaker sessions this afternoon. Both starting at 4 o'clock. Back here in this room, we have Sex and Dating After Transition. And then in the Emerald Room, there is a panel on Parenting the Transgender Child. Those are both from starting at 4. So we'll see you at the next session. Thank you.